Hey, sign up for their Future Hindsight newsletter. We'll pop into your inbox every Monday with a link to the episode and extra tips and tricks on how you can be the spark in 2025. Sign up now at futurehindsight.com. It's an easy, fun, and free way to support the show. futurehindsight.com. Oh, and while you're there, if you need a stronger push to get engaged and stay engaged all through the year, pick up your very own Future Hindsight desk calendar. It's cute and quaint, and it will keep you inspired every day. All right, let's get to the episode. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. We are squarely in a time of cynicism and mass frustration with our main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. I know that I'm not alone when I say that on many issues, whether that's foreign policy or economic policy, it doesn't seem to matter too much which party I vote for. Neither one is truly representing me. In this context, it's worth asking, what is the role of parties anyway, and are they really important to democracy? Our guest is Didi Kuo. She's a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and a scholar of comparative politics with a focus on democratization, corruption, and clientelism, political parties, and institutions, and political reform. She's the author of The Great Retreat, How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't. It comes out on February 3rd. Welcome, Didi. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So let's start with the basics and your title. What is the function of a political party, and how does that make them agents of democracy?
Well, part of the book's motivation is to clarify that political parties are not just narrow groups that seek to win elections. I think we have a conception today that parties are these professional organizations that are run by some sometimes indistinguishable group of elites and office seekers and politicians, and maybe some narrow groups that are also vying for power within a party, and that they seek to win. But that's a really narrow definition. If we expand our historical perspective and bring in basically the history of democracy itself, we come to see that parties are actually organizations that do two things. The first is that they structure democratic competition in meaningful ways within a democratic society. They provide voters with choices in elections, in other words, and they link those choices to governing policies to which voters can then hold them accountable. And the second thing that parties do that is crucial is they're the intermediary between citizens and government. When it really comes to representing your interests and then turning those interests into policies that may meaningfully make a difference in your life, it is only political parties that are tasked with doing that. So when democracy was first expanding, all of the kind of advanced industrial democracies we have today were initially limited democracies, where the suffrage was limited to property-owning white men. This is true in the United States and also in many countries of Western Europe. So at that time, political parties were just small elite factions in the legislature that were maybe brought together by shared interests, and they could work together to accomplish shared goals. But as democracy expanded and the suffrage was opened to new groups in society, there needed to be some way to mobilize all of those new voters into the practice of democracy. So it was really political parties that established local organizations. They went out and created very nascent and early forms of what we would now think of as voter registration, election registers. They organized elections themselves, and initially parties did things like print their own newspapers and print their own ballots on election day. That wasn't something the state took over until the late 19th century. Mm-hmm. So as a result, parties perform like so many crucial democratic functions. They mobilize citizens, they represent their interests, they take this diffuse, heterogeneous set of interests and turn them into something more ideologically coherent. They socialize and recruit new candidates for office, and ultimately they govern.
Yeah, thanks for providing the historical context. I want to dig a little bit deeper on the history because so much has changed in this time,
Yes.
especially where we are today and how we think about parties. And I feel like what's important to remember is how constituents used to be represented by the liberal or the left
Yes.
party or by the conservatives, because those have been muddled, and I think there's a huge confusion as to who is really representing whom, although, of course, I've mentioned at the top that it doesn't feel like anybody is truly representing us. So looking back in history, who were the people on the left and who were the people on the right?
That's a great question. When it comes to the left and right, one of the main goals of this book is to understand parties in a neoliberal era. So about since the 1970s, we know that parties have undergone really significant changes. And oftentimes when we talk about the things that have happened in the world, whether it's globalization or the decline of unions or economic inequality, there are so many different examples. We think of them as happening like to us, exogenously somehow, even a technology and communications revolution. But political parties facilitated a lot of these changes, and they actively played a role in creating the kind of relationship of democracy and capitalism we have today. Now, if you go way back to the 19th century, you already saw people criticize the idea that democracy and capitalism could coexist. So going back, for example, to Karl Marx and people like that, their argument was that capitalists will inevitably have more power in any kind of open system. They naturally have more resources, they control the economy, etc. And over time, that developed into a hypothesis that Charles Lindblom has termed the structural power thesis, that capitalists just have a special kind of power even in democratic systems. But what that has meant is that political parties play a fundamental role in channeling an alternate power to capital. They've done this through mobilizing parties on the left. Originally, in the 19th century, these parties demanded both political rights, like extensions of suffrage, and also economic rights. These were often workers in manual trades that faced a lot of risk in the kind of jobs that they took as factories and sort of manufacturing grew in industrial democracies. And as they articulated these sets of rights, they organized labor-based parties and parties on the left. The left-right spectrum eventually came to mean a left that was identified with rights of workers and individuals to participate in their politics and also to claim some level of security for themselves, economic security. And on the right was associated with some pre-existing landed or corporate interests. They often were tied to the ancien regime in places that democratized early on. In the United States, the right was associated with, say, agricultural interests, landed interests, or owners of capital. And then after World War II, the left-right spectrum continues to mean robust competition between parties that traditionally represent like labor constituencies and then parties that represent more conservative and traditional interests. And at the time, you did have also a compromise with parties of the right. They understood that to have robust capitalism, you also needed democracy to work well and to be able to articulate an array of interests, and that you needed the state to do some things too. You did need to have regulation and basic contract enforcement and rule of law in order to have economic growth and to allow markets to flourish. Since the 1970s, however, we've seen a real erosion, not only of what the state ought to do vis-a-vis markets, but also of what the left and the right mean.
Thanks for the historical context. So there are, of course, multiple forces at play that brought about our current state of party weakness.
Yes.
And has resulted in the abdication of parties in their traditional intermediary roles with the onset of neoliberalism and essentially the overall adoption worldwide of this ideological frame. But before we go over those, I'm curious, what are the stakes on whether we succeed or fail in strengthening political parties?
To me, the stakes really couldn't be higher. For the past at least 15 years, we've been in what some scholars refer to as a democratic recession. So after the end of the Cold War, the number of democracies around the world was increasing, and there was also a lot of support from the advanced democracies for institutions and processes of democracy in other parts of the world. We now know that since 2005 or so, the number of democracies has not only kind of stagnated or even declined, but also that indicators of democracy within places that have long taken it for granted, like the United States, have also been eroding. At the same time, we know that there's been a rise in economic discontent. There have been many more global protests since 2017 because people don't feel like democratic participation through normal channels maybe gets the kind of change that they require. And people have taken to the streets to denounce corruption, to be sort of anti-authoritarian and pro-democracy, and most importantly, to also articulate economic grievances and argue that they need more to be able to have, sustainable and fulfilling lives. So in understanding, these twin crises, one of democracy on the one hand and one of sort of capitalism or economics on the other, we really need to understand what it is democracies are failing to do for their citizens. And that really lies in a failure of representation and of articulating those interests and translating them into meaningful policy. That is a problem of political parties.
Yeah, so that's why we need political parties, so that we can actually participate in democracy. Because right now, you called it voting but not choosing. And I thought that was really a great way to describe kind of what we're doing. We're going to the ballot box, but we're not really choosing. It's sort of,
a little bit predetermined.
This apple or that other apple, but there are no oranges,
Exactly. That's a very good way of putting it. Yes, variations on an apple with no oranges. And I think that the stakes are that we have a long history of democratization, where countries transition to democracy and then they either kind of consolidate or they don't. And we know that one of the keys to being able to have long-lasting, sustainable democracy is having robust party competition. So not only strong political parties, but also parties that are distinguishable from one another, that provide voters with enough choices in elections and enough information to then hold those parties accountable. And when parties are weak, you really sever this primary mechanism between citizens and the state.
Yes. Well, you make that argument really well. You say that over the last 5 decades or so, the three underlying dynamics that drove the weakening of parties are prioritizing pro-market and anti-state policies for growth, declining responsiveness to major policy areas, and relying on the private sector. And these are all, of course, the result of the wholesale adoption and faith in neoliberalism, which seems to be the umbrella ideology that fueled a lot of the policy changes, or maybe all of the policy changes on the ground. So in terms of political parties, what does neoliberalism say about the function of parties? Just now we talked about the fact that parties today are not that different from each other, but is there something that neoliberalism actually says, that tells us how they want parties to behave?
It's a great question, and I think a hard question, because we use the term neoliberalism, I think, in popular settings to mean so many different things, late-stage capitalism or just kind of a bucket term. And I think neoliberalism actually does not really say much about parties. Originally, when it started as a sort of set of economic theories in the 1970s or maybe even earlier, but when they really began to be adopted by parties, it was as a way of kind of rebutting the conventional wisdom about the relationship of states and markets. So instead of kind of traditional liberalism that requires kind of a big interventionist state, neoliberal orthodoxies stressed, letting markets do their thing, deregulating, scaling down the scope of state action, and also allowing private markets to make more decisions about labor or about where things should be sort of housed geographically, allowing much more mobility of capital and labor. And the thing that's, I think, a little bit difficult to convince people of is that the left and the right adopted neoliberal policies, maybe not to the same degree, but that they both did. Now, after the 2024 election, I think that it's maybe much less controversial to say that something like the Democrats are also neoliberal. But sometimes when I talk to different groups of people, I really get pushback on whether or not the left and the right are similar when it comes to economic policy. And if we go all the way back to the 1980s, we see that Republicans were doing very well and conservative governments in Western Europe as well. And it really left parties of the left in the wilderness. They were wondering how they would be electable again. And at the same time, the Cold War was ending, which was not necessarily super clear. But after the early 1990s, the left came back, and it came back by basically moving to the right on a lot of economic policy areas, saying that we were going to embrace more deregulation, lowering corporate tax rates, allowing capital markets to grow, and to create more global competition through economic integration and trade. I actually do think that there was a real hope in the 1990s when a lot of Democrats and parties of the left were elected to power that they could create something for a global era that would be democratic worldwide. I think there was an idea that if you create economic growth, countries will become more democratic. You had all of these post-communist societies that were embracing political and economic liberalization at the same time. And the United States and its allies used international institutions as well to promote ideas that were both political and economic, that if you liberalized your markets, you would also create fewer restraints on individuals. You could adopt, a theory of individual rights that allowed both markets and democracy to flourish.
But it was a heady time. I mean,
indeed.
I think we all were believing it.
Right.
The Berlin Wall fell, and we were like, oh my God, it's time of peace, and we're going to have growth and prosperity. And look at Ireland. You see, when everybody has a car and has income, they will stop fighting.
Exactly.
And things like this. But that's not actually what happened. In fact, these pro-market anti-state policies were things like NAFTA and globalization writ large, which, of course, really resulted in a political landscape that made it easy to not represent people, but to represent corporate interests. So, the other take you had was that parties are declining in responsiveness to major policy areas. And we just discussed that some of these, pro-market policies were things like NAFTA and globalization, which, again, has caused a lot of hardship for people all across the United States, especially in the manufacturing sector. But so I'm wondering, though, when it comes to unresponsiveness, is that, in your mind, an action? Or is that just a do nothing? Like, when you say parties are not responsive, what do you mean by that?
So I think that I mean it in two ways. The first is that we know after, over a decade of really high levels of partisan polarization in the United States, that it's become much harder for at least Congress to act on major areas that the American public wants action on. So there have been immigration deals that came close but didn't pass. There's always debates about, climate or gun regulation. And a lot of times when the Supreme Court acts in one area, there are calls for Congress to act as well, like on abortion, for example. But when I say responsiveness, I think I mean a more technical term, which is that there's been a lot of empirical research in the social sciences and in political science in particular, showing that many legislatures and policies, not just in the United States, but across the affluent world, are more responsive to the interests of wealthy voters than they are to the interests of middle and low-income voters. It goes back a little bit to what we were saying about globalization creating winners and losers, and politicians at the time not really having the foresight to realize that, those transitions would be costly and that there might be people who, when they are hurt, should be compensated in some way or should at least be acknowledged, rather than this kind of heady rising tide lifts all boats mentality that I think was pervasive. And so we have a lot of areas in which the American public is actually to the left of politicians, sometimes to the left of both the Democratic and Republican parties, especially on economic areas regarding redistribution or the distribution of services and regulation of corporations, that kind of thing. The American public tends to want more actions that the government just doesn't take up as policy ideas. And that problem is one that's been called affluence bias or a crisis of responsiveness, that even at the individual level of members of Congress, people who represent districts that have more low-income voters are still more likely to be responsive to affluent donors, many of whom are not from their district, than they are to those constituents. So it's been an interesting pattern where, as you've seen a decline, we can all identify a decline in labor unions and parties of the left and in their traditional alignments with really liberal policies. But we even see politicians kind of in the aggregate setting government policies, regardless of administration, that are not responsive to the interests of low and middle income voters.
A lot of people would argue that that was the failure of the Democratic Party in the last election, that even in the promises made by the vice president's campaign, it wasn't enough. There weren't enough promises made, or they weren't strong enough. I don't know, maybe the wording was wrong. To promise $25,000 to help you buy your first house seems like a big deal, but I think it was essentially dismissed. I think actually it wasn't believed is one of the things, is that people are like, is she really going to do that? Because how is she going to do that? You mentioned unresponsiveness also in the context of congressional politics, right? Because you have to pass these laws to make that happen. So if you cannot work with Congress as the president and pass policies like writing $25,000 checks, then your promises are empty. And you're really,
That's right.
You're really not delivering anything at all. You're just empty talk. And I think that's really where we are in many ways. And I think that's one of the reasons somebody like Trump could take over the Republican Party, because, of course, the Republican Party was weak, which is why he was able to take it over and remake it into a populist party. We'll be right back with Didi Kuo, so stay with us. Stick around for a dose of hope with this episode's Civic Spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, I want to share about another podcast that I think you might be interested in. It may be no surprise, but I know many of us are worried about the state of sexual and reproductive health in the United States and around the world, and worried about the direction we're headed in. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Maybe you don't know how to help or where to begin. So when I'm feeling that way, I listen to this podcast called Repros Fight Back. They talk about abortion, birth control access, child marriage, sex ed, Black maternal health, LGBTQI+ rights, and so much more. The host, Jenny, is very real and honestly feels like your friend. She has cats, she bakes, she reads romance books, and she asks the questions you have always wanted to ask to leaders and advocates in reproductive rights, and then gives you things you can do to fight back. Their topics are vast, like how sexual and reproductive health and rights are provided in emergency settings, how Project 2025 is already in action, and how the administration and the Supreme Court are influencing our health and our rights. You listen to Future Hindsight, so I know you want to be inspired, empowered, and in the know. So go listen and subscribe to Repros Fight Back. You can find it on any podcast app. I also want to share about a podcast I've been listening to called De Novo.
Listen now to a new series from Houses on the Moon Theater Company. On the streets of Guatemala City, gang members were Edgar's only family. But he dreamed of a different future.
Edgar, we're missing a player. You want to join us?
Sale. I like playing soccer. The guys from the gang didn't play soccer. They only stole and did drugs.
To leave the gang was a death sentence.
They want to kill him. What are we gonna do?
Coming to the U.S. was his only hope.
I don't want to go back to Guatemala. If I go back to Guatemala, they're going to kill me.
Your Honor, Edgar is now before you for his final chance to save his life.
De Novo is a new podcast series from Houses on the Moon Theater Company. Through real-life court transcripts and first-person interviews, De Novo tells the true story of a case that challenges the conscience of a nation. Listen now and subscribe to Houses on the Moon wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Didi Kuo. The question I have here is one of the things you mentioned is that, you want responsiveness from a party. And in the aftermath of Mitt Romney's campaign, there was this whole autopsy of what happened and what Republicans should do and be more responsive to citizens. But instead, it became an anti-systems party, and it's dedicated, in fact, to a project of ungoverning. And I'm kind of wondering why you think that was more appealing and a more accessible way to remake the party than doing the work to rebuild the party.
So I guess I would say two things. The first is that I don't think we can understand the rise of the far right, not just in the United States, but in a lot of the advanced democracies, without understanding this weakness of parties for decades. Because you create rising distrust in people when the parties are not responsive. You also have these economic grievances in a sense that politicians are not going to address them. And that creates really fertile ground, not just for demagoguery, but also for populist messaging about how the elites don't care about you, they're all corrupt. I mean, I think that that's why in 2016, both Bernie Sanders, who's very much on the left, and Donald Trump were resonating with so many voters across the political spectrum, is that inherent critique of the political system was not without merit at all. Now, the Republican Party itself, I think, is such an interesting case of why it is so difficult to tell if a party is weak or strong. So after 2012, when the Republican autopsy went virtually ignored, something else was happening, which is that there were internal divisions within the party to strengthen the factions that I think we would now associate with this really nihilistic, ungoverning strategy, and I think led the way to someone who's openly authoritarian in some of his leanings, Donald Trump, because we started to see a fight between the mainstream center-right, people like Mitt Romney, and these insurgent initially Tea Party factions who eventually became the Freedom Caucus factions. They were all a little bit different. Paul Ryan was Mitt Romney's running mate, and he was associated with these young guns Kevin McCarthy and Eric Cantor, who were going to bring smart libertarianism to the Republican Party. And then when eventually that morphed into the Freedom Caucus and a group of politicians who really just were much more anti-system, openly so, and not necessarily affiliated with any kind of clear economic agenda, they were much more sort of culture warriors than anything else. I think the party was really at a loss for what to do to kind of govern across these factions. And in a two-party system, it becomes very difficult once you've had a hostile takeover of one of the major parties to know what to do. In a lot of the European systems where you have a far-right party emerging, they are their own party and are therefore more containable in a party system. Here in the United States, in 2016, I think that the party was shocked when Donald Trump became the nominee, and yet it did not exert any of its leverage as a party to be able to block his candidacy. And then by the time you get to 2020 and 2024, it seems to be a foregone conclusion that Trump is not only the de facto leader of the party, but also that he can just exert minimum leverage and kick out all of those moderate centrist Republicans that once existed and who I now think are politically homeless. If you just look at the Republican platforms alone, in 2016, the Republican platform was very much a professional, glossy document. It's very long. It's slickly produced. In 2020, there's basically no platform. There's kind of we readopt the 2016 platform because there were no conventions. And this year, in 2024, the Republican platform is 2 pages. It's maybe written in Comic Sans. It's a Word document that follows a lot of the way President...
It's not a serious platform.
Exactly.
With serious policy prescriptions. But now that we've discussed kind of just how weak actually the Republican Party continues to be, because it's really under the boot of one person, and thinking about the Democratic defeat in the presidential election, they're trying to figure out what they want to do next. What would your advice be for them in this moment so that they can avoid the fate that the Republican Party is in? Or, to say to avoid that fate would be maybe wrong, but what can Democrats actually do that makes them a legitimate party, again, an intermediary for citizens, and at the same time, in the process of doing that, reinvigorate democracy?
I think that it's not going to come at the level of elite policy planning. It's going to be going really back to basics of what is a party. You should revitalize your local party organizations. You should revitalize student and ancillary organizations under the banner of the Democratic Party. Old school party building is what I would encourage, is actually what I think is absolutely necessary. All of the money that was invested in swing states, there are all these places in the country being neglected, honestly, by both parties, but where you just need to go back to basics, listen to people. What is it that they need? It seems like Democrats really missed the boat on basic issues, inflation, cost of living, et cetera, which, the parties of the left are the ones that are supposed to be better on those issues to begin with. Listen to people and craft maybe sometimes what are seen as kind of minimalist policies, like Gretchen Whitmer's whole motto of fix the damn roads. Sometimes it is just basic pounding the pavement, how can I solve local problems type things. But I think you also need at a meta level to be doing intellectual work around building an alternative to neoliberalism that is actually kind of gritty and tractable. In other words, something like Bidenomics, that's about industrial policy and semiconductors and things like that, like, it's not going to really resonate with average citizens. And it's certainly not something that's going to be super visible. A lot of it is like a pass-through to the private sector to incentivize different kinds of, to some sectors over others. And really...
But isn't that still a neoliberal frame?
To
absolutely. Rely on the private sector.
Exactly.
So, this is one of the other ones that you mentioned. The third prong here is that...
reliance on the private sector.
That the reliance on the private sector. And so I kind of feel like when we're talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, people are like, well, the people who are getting tax breaks are wind farms.
Right.
But, I'm the everyday Joe and I own no wind farms.
Exactly. I totally agree.
So I'm not getting a tax break.
How is that supposed to be a bread and butter or a kitchen table issue? It's not.
It just isn't.
So thinking about like how you can reclaim the state for good, like here's what the government will do for you, and it will be good for you. I think that we've been in many decades of sowing a lot of distrust in the state and basically seeding, I wouldn't just call it a conservative agenda, but I think that there's been kind of a cross-party cynicism that the government ever does anything good. And
plus also because it relies on the private sector.
That's right.
In delivering
services.
In performing a government function.
Exactly. That's right.
Actually, can you give us an example so that people, when they hear this episode, they know, like, what does it mean for the government to outsource to the private sector
a
government function?
In the era of globalization and neoliberalism, a lot of companies started to do things like outsource, meaning, for example, if they have an HR department, they'll outsource that to a separate company that handles, like, HR, or they'll outsource billing and paying their workers to a separate company that can handle all of that. So when we see that in government, everyone might remember the rollout of the ACA's, the Affordable Care Act's, like online health platform. So that was a private company that received a government contract to develop a website. And that has been happening across government for many decades, that instead of the government actively performing the service, it will provide contracts to companies that will then perform that service. Now, the really difficult thing about governing in that way is the promise is that companies are more efficient and the private sector can be relied on to solve its problems more quickly, et cetera. The problem is that it's difficult to hold these companies accountable. There's certainly no democratic accountability. And then it also makes a lot of the work of these services invisible to citizens. So they don't attribute it to the government. There's a scholar at Cornell, Suzanne Mettler, who's written very compellingly about what she calls the submerged state, that a lot of the tax breaks you get, for example, in education or in home ownership or various things, are actively like the government giving you something, but because they maybe happen through tax expenditures and such, you don't see it that way. It doesn't register as you as a citizen having received a benefit from government. So as a result, it just creates, not only an incentive to, like, once you've started contracting and outsourcing, and you are
bring it back in-house.
Exactly. It's really hard to bring it back in-house, especially when most people think, oh God, why would we want to hire more bureaucrats and civil servants? And we saw there was a real politicization when President Biden wanted to fund more IRS agents. I mean, we need IRS agents to literally just collect the basic revenues that the government uses. And that was actively politicized. So we now, I think, especially after the COVID pandemic, people who work for the government have had their lives threatened across the board. Election administrators and people on the school board and like tax collectors, even postal workers, like public health officers, people you would not think should be the target of anybody's ire, have been elevated in the public discourse as enemies simply because they work for the state. And I think all of that creates really propitious ground for someone like President Trump to say, well, then let's just take an axe to all of it. And that's a scary, scary place to be. But it's because for decades now, people don't know what government does. They think it's mainly bad and inefficient. And neither political party will come to the defense of the state.
Yeah. We actually had a whole conversation with Nancy Rosenblum on her news book on governing.
I love her.
And she's amazing. But it was the kind of thing where exactly that, basically the public administration of government is essentially illegible. We can't see it, so we don't know what it does, and we don't know why we should care about the people who perform a lot of the essential functions for the government to exist, and therefore to make our lives, function also, because we rely on getting Social Security checks or getting on public transportation.
Exactly.
All of these things that seem made out of magic, but they're not, of course. Somebody is processing your social security checks.
Right.
There's a human who does that.
Exactly.
So we mentioned just now the reliance on the private sector, and this conversation would not be complete without talking about the outsized role of billionaires in the economy, on public policy, and in electoral politics. Not only do they throw their money around and compel government to react in response, like, for example, when Bill Gates funds vaccine research, the FDA then has to spend government dollars to test those vaccines for safety, right? So we are mobilizing government dollars in response to billionaire dollars. And if you're an everyday person, you might want the government dollars to be spent elsewhere. But more importantly, billionaires are not elected and are not accountable. And given that the demise of billionaires is nowhere on the horizon, are democracy and capitalism, going back to the beginning of our conversation here, just not compatible, or at least not compatible in the current iteration?
Right. I mean, it's funny because when I was writing this book, I had a small section on billionaires because there were billionaires who threw their weight around in the 2016 election. And as I was writing it and trying to update it, I mean, you can never stay fully caught up to politics, but there's no way I could have predicted that, like, this election would involve billionaires to the extent that it did. One thing that was really surprising is that, we have a theory that a ground game is important in electoral politics. So even though I think a lot of the local organizations of Republicans and Democrats have withered away, we do know that in election time, you get all of your volunteers, you get them to knock on doors, and that can really help you. And Kamala Harris raised much more money to be able to do that in the swing states. And Trump outsourced that ground game to super PACs, and primarily a super PAC led by Elon Musk. And the FEC allowed this to happen, even though usually you cannot coordinate between a campaign and a super PAC. So I was like, surely this can't work, right? All of our conventional wisdom tells us that, like, a billionaire running weird lotteries about, like, I'll give a voter however much money if they sign this petition about the First Amendment. Like, it's such a bizarre way to think about mobilizing. And yet, that's what really seemed to work. Not that alone, of course. But the role of billionaires has become more important more quickly than I think anyone could have imagined. And it challenges democracy and capitalism for precisely the reasons that you articulated, that billionaires are not accountable and they've become really important political actors. But the main implication that I talk about in the book is that if we no longer go to government for demands, we either don't trust that government is going to fulfill its promises, or we don't see solutions that are kind of state-based, then increasingly, I think people want to be represented and they will take those claims elsewhere. So what I really worry about is that business is now put in this really awkward position where in the past, business had a very long-standing cozy relationship to the Republican Party. And after the 1990s, they definitely started to become closer to the Democratic Party as well, especially the emerging sort of neoliberal knowledge economy sectors. And you had a kind of playbook of how business would participate in politics, lobbying and wanting a certain economic agenda. But now, a lot of social and political hot-button issues are being brought into the business world in strange ways. So, for example, your consumers may want you to have certain political positions or to be ethical or, like, embrace stakeholder capitalism. We've seen this rise in ESG and corporations wanting to kind of convince Americans that they care about more than just profits and the bottom line.
But isn't that just all smoke and mirrors? Like, I don't think corporations take that seriously. I think they're doing it for marketing purposes.
I think it could be marketing, but I think it's in response to this perception that people want you to speak out politically. When in the past, like, I don't think we necessarily cared, right? Like, what a corporate position is on a political issue. And then there's also, I think, workers are now wanting their employers to, there's some very basic democracy stuff corporations can do, like give your employees a day off to vote. But there's often, like, political issues in the workplace, either people wanting the company to make a statement about a certain political crisis that is unfolding, or companies having to manage political conflict within the workplace. And then ultimately, I think that there's just a sense that billionaires and companies, like, are trusted sometimes in a way that our politicians are not, right?
Yeah. Like, how is that a thing? How are people trusting Elon Musk and not Joe Biden?
I truly don't
like
know.
as a point of comparison, it's just a mystery. I think I would say we had Jeff Charlotte on last year also, and it was the kind of thing where, we talked about sort of this cult of, what is it called? The cult of when you do well. And basically, if you do well, then that means basically you are blessed by God and you're like one of the chosen people. And so this means that you're good. If you're financially successful, that means you're a good human and you're a good person. And so if you're a billionaire, that means that you're an extra good person. At least, I know a lot of evangelicals believe this. So I think this has been also like a huge, American exceptionalism myth that when you are financially successful, you're somehow a superior person, which of course you're not. But I think people really believe that and, go about their lives orienting their decisions in this way.
Well, two things. First, I think that billionaires have been very successful at their own public image. So when you had the Bill Gates example, I mean, he's someone who talks about unleashing the forces of capitalism to solve the world's problems. And we've seen a lot of billionaires basically say, like, we are enlightened people who can build philanthropies, we can bring our resources to bear on these pressing public issues, especially when the government may not be super responsive. And a lot of times they mean that outside of the United States. But still, philanthropy is another area where it's been hugely influential in how it seeds different kinds of civil society, like projects or attention. In other words, you see billionaire influence both very obvious ways, like in campaign finance, and also in really subtle ways that I think are difficult to kind of measure or observe.
Right. Well, let's talk about campaign finance because you mentioned PACs, and we have not talked about that yet. And of course, this is the mechanism by which billionaires can throw their weight around by giving a lot of money to PACs, political action committees. And for example, you cite two big campaign finance reforms, the McCain-Feingold and Citizens United, which both perversely have made our polarization more intense because it has enabled people with deep pockets to throw away their round even more than before. I know that Jane Mayer would argue that before Citizens United, people on the far right have already spent billions, but we just couldn't see it. And now they're just brazenly spending money everywhere. But talk to us about how these campaign finance reforms actually made the problem worse.
It's a problem sometimes of unintended consequences. In 2000, when they were debating the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, the support for it was driven by the perception that political parties were too corrupt. And at the time, Bill Clinton had gotten in trouble for maybe, selling stays in the Lincoln bedroom to wealthy donors. So BICRA capped the amount that you could donate directly to campaigns and also limited how much you could donate to political parties, specifically soft money, which is used for electioneering purposes. Now, when that happened, it kind of had the effect of decentralizing a lot of campaign finance, which used to flow through the parties and now kind of flowed right outside the parties. Then after Citizens United, when the Supreme Court said that corporations, which also includes labor unions and nonprofits, can spend unlimited amounts on independent expenditures, that was a way of kind of empowering campaign finance groups outside of the party system entirely. So these are now groups like 501c4s that can raise unregulated amounts of money. So it doesn't have to be reported like when you donate to a campaign or to a party under FEC laws. And you also don't have to disclose who the donors are. Or alternatively, the donors can call themselves some other entity. So like you and I could be Citizens for Peace and give a lot of our money that way without ever having to say our actual names in a disclosure form. Now that's had the effect of creating what I think of as para-party organizations. So in the past, when campaign money flows through the parties, like the party can direct which campaigns are going to get the resources and where should the volunteers go, that kind of thing. Whereas now, it's all of these other groups that are raising money from people that we don't know, and the amounts of money are very staggering, and that can spend unlimited money on being pro and for various candidates, even though they cannot coordinate with those candidates' campaigns directly. They can campaign on behalf of certain issues, and they can do that through digital ads, regular television ads, direct mail. All of the typical ways that we mobilize voters are now available to these groups. And what's so difficult is that political parties may sometimes be helped by these organizations, right? Like they may both want Kamala Harris to win. But ultimately, these groups don't respond to anyone, and they don't really have members. Like these are not even social movements. They're these really ad hoc groups of, very tiny numbers of very rich donors who come to influence really specific elections. Sometimes it's members of Congress, sometimes it's the president, sometimes it's like a state Supreme Court judge. Or ballot initiatives, in California or in other states, all of those. And it's difficult with the Supreme Court configured the way it is to imagine robust campaign finance regulation anytime soon. But I will just say that other advanced democracies don't allow this kind of unfettered campaign finance. There are much stricter regulations on all aspects of elections, like who donates to which party. And, the state often subsidizes parties in other parts of the world. And the election window also tends to be much shorter, whereas we have, kind of a state of a permanent election for our members of Congress. So, yeah, the billionaire influence and campaign finance system has really exploded in the past few years, but I think that's given rise to party weakening trends rather than party enhancing trends.
Oh, yeah, I totally agree, because it basically shuts the party out.
Right.
So it's time to get money out of politics, and it's also time to reclaim the state. And I'm not sure we have all the answers of what will work to get us there, but in your mind, what's the social contract that we need going forward? What's your vision for this?
Sometimes I feel very glad that I am not a policymaker, actually. I think that it would be really difficult to craft. But I think that at the very least, we need a good sense in the 21st century of what global capital means for democratic societies. What outsized power does it give some actors over others? And what does it mean to try to develop coalitions in this new era? So if I say we're all workers, I mean, that might be kind of factually true, but we know that across different sectors, across different levels of education, it's really difficult to identify a worker the way you could back when we had factories and manufacturing. And one of the big problems with the partisan realignment of, the left is now basically getting a base of support from highly educated professionals in cities, and the right increasingly draws support from the working class. This is an inversion of their historical constituencies. It makes it really difficult to know what those kinds of coalitions are going to look like moving forward. But at the very least, I think having a clear sense of materialist politics, what is it that your average, family making X amount of money needs, and what does their life look like? What kinds of opportunities? What kinds of mobility? What are the cost of living issues, et cetera? Trying to get just even a descriptive understanding of what that is, I think will be very helpful for both parties. I mean, I don't think either party really has a working class political agenda right now, even though I think they make appeals to them in different ways. There's a really excellent McKinsey report actually about a social contract for the 21st century but it's not just McKinsey. It's obviously a lot of social scientists. I know. They have a research arm. It is really out of left field.
That makes no sense.
I know, but it's you have a lot of people recognizing that this is not a sustainable economy, in other words.
Right.
And the sort of gigification and precarity and, all of the ways that people no longer receive support from the state, I think is one that neither party really wants to acknowledge, but they will have to. And you have to acknowledge that there's also...
I mean, we're acknowledging it now, aren't we?
Exactly,
By electing Trump. I mean, I think that's an acknowledgement.
Okay, that's a very good point, yes.
So I have only two more questions.
Okay.
Every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guests to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. What's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us today into action?
Well, I've noticed that a lot of your previous guests have said to get involved in local politics, and I would echo that, which is there are issues you care about. You may not like either of the parties, but if you get involved locally, then you can work towards solutions with people who care about the same thing, and I think that's really good democratic practice. But I would also say the civic spark is to just support the party builders, okay? If you don't want to get involved with your local party, which is something I would encourage, when somebody says they are pro a party, like I am a Democrat or I am a Republican, or they say they want to work within that party, we have become so allergic to those kinds of people. Most of our politicians these days capitalize on anti-party sentiment in order to appeal to people. But support the party builders, the ones who want to, actually build a lasting institution and think about the party as a brand. All of that is stuff we should be running towards, not away from.
Hear, hear. I like it. So, last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
Well, I suppose this is actually looking into the recent past, but there have been a few democracies around the world that have elected liberal leaders who had authoritarian tendencies. And in those countries, I'm thinking Poland, Brazil, France, although France not doing super well right now, there have been groups, political parties, and civil society actors who came together and created broad civil society coalitions put aside their differences to make sure that they could stop the election of this authoritarian leader, either for a second time or for a first time. And it takes years of mobilizing and compromising to be able to do that. But I think that that's a real lesson for the United States right now, that if we can kind of get out of our bubbles and shake off some of our anti-party or some of our kind of like narrow self-interested goals and just work in common for a democracy that's going to be meaningful and robust in the future, then that is something that can be done. And we've seen it happen in other places. We can learn from them directly. And I am very hopeful and confident that that will happen here.
Oh, I am hopeful too. I really am, actually. I am hopeful that a complete failure of governance in the Trump administration will actually make people realize that we need government and we need democracy and we need to do these things together and we cannot do them alone. Well, thank you, Didi, for joining us on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Didi Kuo is the author of The Great Retreat, How Political Parties Should Behave and Why They Don't, and a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Get involved at the local party level and support the party builders. When you speak to someone who is into party building, don't be allergic. We need to rebuild and invest in these institutions. They're here to represent the people. In other words, us. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Alyssa Fader. She's the executive director and co-founder of Rising Organizer, an organization that trains new and emerging leaders in community organizing skills and thus makes organizing a more accessible pathway to civic participation.
Our theory of change is that if more everyday people know how to organize in their communities, we will have a more responsive government that is reflective of the needs of everyday people.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, don't forget to hit that follow button on your podcast app. You see it. It's right there. This way, our episodes will stay in your rotation every week. Thanks for tuning in. And until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zach Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.